Welcome to today's lecture on evolution of games, specifically the video game beginnings. This lecture is brought to you by Lake Minneola High School, and it is designed for the Game Simulation and Animation Foundations course. Our essential question is, how has the evolution of the game industry to the modern generation of hardware impacted society? Looking at Generation Zero contained the very beginning elements of the modern video game industry. We see the first video game patent issued in 1948 for a game that fired missiles at targets. This game was actually designed after a World War II style radar display. It was made of an analog circuitry and cathode ray tubes, and it utilized a screen overlay as the targets. Dots on the screen represented missiles, so you would fire the dots towards your screen overlays, which were your targets. Continuing in Generation Zero, we see that in 1958, we get Tennis for Two. Tennis for Two is the original predecessor to Pong, or tennis. And what we're seeing with the 1958 version is it played on an oscilloscope, and it was far too expensive to play because it took up a large portion of a room, and it also took a lot of different scientific equipment. In 1966, we get the first television projection game. This used a light gun as a user interface, and it worked with CRT televisions, which were common at the time in many different households. In Generation 1, beginning around 1971, we first see coin-operated arcade games. So at this point, we've moved from an early stage of just using scientific equipment, then we see the first piece of a modern gaming system using a TV, and then we see our coin-operated arcade games in the 70s. We first see Space War and Computer Space in 1971. Computer Space is the first cabinet-based game, this meaning it is solely a single unit of hardware that contains a user interface as well as the graphical display. In 1972, we get the first commercial success, which is Pong, and we see different video game arcades throughout the 70s and 80s, just sprouting everywhere, malls, external locations, next to movie theaters, etc. In Generation 2, beginning around 1972, we see the game console revolutionized. We actually begin to see game consoles as we currently view them. They are simple computers that could be plugged into a home television. In 1972, Magnavox released the Magnavox Odyssey. However, it failed due to misconception, as many individuals believed that the Magnavox Odyssey could only work on Magnavox televisions. While this was not true, that was the misconception at the time. In 1977, Atari released the Atari 2600. The Atari 2600 revolutionized the game industry as we know it. They introduced ROM cartridges that allowed consumers to use a single console to play multiple games. You just simply had to change out your cartridge. Around 1982, the game industry began to crash due to a lack of consumer confidence. However, fortunately, in Generation 3, Nintendo saved the industry around 1985 with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo at this point also introduced Super Mario Bros. In 1989, Nintendo released the Nintendo Gameboy. This made gaming portable for the very first time. And it also started off, Generation 3 consoles started off an industry war called the graphics war. Many different companies were working on who could have the best graphics. Generation 3 started off with an 8-bit processor. But moving into Generation 4, we can see we have 16-bit processors, and we see many different consoles on the market. We see the Sega Genesis, which has greatly improved color, graphics, and character movements. Again, this is related to the 16-bit graphics. And in 1991, Nintendo released its second game console, which was the Super Nintendo, or the SNES as it was familiarly known. In 1998, the Game Boy Color introduced color into the portable gaming realm. And in 2001, Game Boy Advance was released. This allowed better graphics, and it also actually allowed 3D emulation and backward compatibility. This was very new in the industry. Moving to Generation 5, around 1994, we start to see CD-ROMs being used in our video game consoles. We also see true 3D, and we see a combination of 32 and 64-bit graphics. In 1994, Sega released the Sega Saturn, and this introduced dual-core processing. In 1995, Sony released its first Sony Playstation, which introduced mature game content to the game industry. And the Sony Playstation was actually originally developed out of research that was being conducted for Nintendo. Sony was working on its own game console, thus Nintendo actually broke its contract with Sony, its research contract with Sony. In 1996, Nintendo released the Nintendo 64, which was the first 64-bit graphic system. However, Nintendo stayed to its tried and true method of using ROM cartridges for game content. Generation 6 consoles, around the year of 2000, introduced DVD-ROMs and 128-bit graphics. They also, because of the graphics being increased to 128 bits, also started to release realistic 3D versus emulated 3D graphics. In 2000, the Sony PlayStation 2 was released. It was the best-selling console to date, selling closer to 150 million sales per units. In 2001, we see Microsoft enter the market. Microsoft being a computer software developer, they released their first gaming console, which introduced online gaming in a marketplace as well as multiplayer. This opened up a brand new industry in terms of gaming that has greatly impacted us from that day forward. In 2001, we see the Nintendo Gamecube. And the Nintendo Gamecube was the first Nintendo console to use optical disc drives. They moved away from cartridges and started using their own disc format. However, the Nintendo Gamecube was a commercial failure due to the lack of technology and also the lack of mature game content. The game industry has seen since Generation 5 a huge revolution in terms of what players are expecting for game content. Nintendo stayed to its original games, introduced a few others, however, it did not meet the players' demands. In Generation 7, beginning around 2004, we see the Nintendo DS, which introduced the dual screen capability in portable gaming. And we also see the Sony PSP, which merged your media with portable gaming. The Sony PSP was able to access Wi-Fi as well as various media content. The Nintendo DS simply had a dual screen that was touchscreen, and it gave better usability to the player. In 2005, we see the Microsoft Xbox 360. This is Microsoft's second game console, and it introduced wireless controllers as a standard user interface. In 2006, the Sony PlayStation 3 is released. The Sony PlayStation 3 introduced the cell processor technology, as well as a 6-axis tilt controller. This was the DualShock 3 controller. In 2006, Nintendo also released its next console, and the Nintendo Wii introduced motion-sensitive controllers. It introduced a Wiimote, as we know it now, and the Wiimote was revolutionary in its completely new user interface design. Looking at our Generation 8 consoles, beginning around 2011, we see the Sony PS Vita is introduced to the market, and the Sony PS Vita brings in 3D projection graphics as well as tilt sensitivity control. While the Nintendo Wii U is released in 2012, it introduces a touchscreen user interface to accompany the console. This is This is relatively interesting because Nintendo introduced mobile gaming, handheld gaming, back in 1989. However, they're now using mobile gaming as an accompaniment for user interfacing with a console-based game. This is a very interesting mix. Microsoft Xbox One is expected to be released in 2013, and it will be introducing an 8-core processor as well as anti-piracy measures to prevent game copying, and it also will use game registration. 2013 will also see the release of the Sony Playstation 4. The Sony Playstation 4 also introduces 8-core processing, and it also introduces your anti-piracy measures. However, it also will introduce PS Vita connectivity. So this is actually going to be the first time we see a direct handheld game being used in conjunction with the console-based station. It's the first time it will actually be able to stream games, not the first time you'll ever be able to transfer information back and forth, as that connectivity was released earlier on. Next, let's review the video game ratings. Video games are rated by a self-regulating body known as the Entertainment Software Rating Board, also known as the ESRB. There are 6 game ratings that we need to be aware of. We have early childhood content. We have E for everyone. We have E10 and up, meaning everyone 10 and older. We have teen. We have mature, 17 and older. And we have 18 and older, which is adults-only content. Each of these ratings are given to a game before its release, and what it's doing is it's trying to give an unbiased rating of a game's content to the audience. So if your parents are buying games, or if you're buying a game for somebody, you know what level of game it is. For example, you wouldn't necessarily want to buy Gears of War, which is a mature game, and give it to somebody who's probably 10 to 11 years old. While that does potentially happen in the market, it is not what we are geared towards, and the game cannot be sold to that individual who is 10 or 11 years old. However, if you're looking to buy a game for somebody who is around that 10 to 11-year-old range, you're looking at something that would be maybe early childhood, everyone, or everyone 10 and up. It really just depends on what the game content is as far as how the ESRB gives its rating. So at this point, check your understanding of the material. If you feel you need to review again, please do so. And if you have any questions, please contact your instructor.